Hello everyone, coming up with another video to actually get started with ASP.NET Core. In the last video I talked about different ways of building web applications using ASP.NET Core. Right, to have a quick recap, we talked about Blazor, we talked about traditional MVC, and we also talked about the Razor pages. So I think in the next few sessions I'm going to talk about how to actually create a web application using the traditional MVC to get started. And then we'll transition into Razor pages and Blazor towards the end of the sessions, right? So first up, before we even get started, the first thing we got to do is install the SDK. SDK stands for Software Development Toolkit, right? You just got to go to .NET.microsoft.com and go ahead and install the .NET Core SDK, right? At the time of this recording, I think it's .NET Core 3.1.x, but that will change obviously. But make sure you install the .NET Core SDK as the first step on your laptop or your machine so that you have the ability to build the applications. Next step is once you install it successfully, it's just a click, just go to the website and just hit download. If you're on Apple, Mac, or if you're on Windows, there are appropriate links for each of them for 64-bit, and you should be able to get that pretty simple. Next step, so there are multiple ways of developing web applications. You can use different tools. You can use Visual Studio as the most popular tool of choice for Microsoft.NET developers. And Visual Studio is in existence for a long, long time. It dates back to, I don't know, over 10 years. It's gone through several iterations, many different versions. They come up with tons of extensions. The marketplace is huge for any type of application that you're writing. It supports more than C#. It supports F# and different languages. I don't even know. I always use C# as my default language. Well, that's the only language. I'd never really go in other than TypeScript on the front end, but mainly C# for the back end. So go ahead and download the Visual Studio. Visual Studio has a community edition. If you go to visualstudio.com, there should be a community edition that is free. All right, go ahead and download that. If you want to pay, if you want to get an official professional license, there's also a pro version of it. And then there's also, for enterprise people, there's an enterprise version as well, right? So, so go ahead and download Visual Studio, and there's also Visual Studio Code. That is also supposed to be a lightweight. Visual Studio tends to get really heavy sometimes with all the plugins and all the features that are packed with it. So it can be overwhelming to fire up, and sometimes it could take a little bit of time and get slow. So there's also VS Code, which is supposed to be lightweight, quick to boot up, quick to shut it down. So if you want to develop on Visual Studio Code, that's also fine. But my preference is for any back-end applications. It could be an API or, like in this case, a traditional web applications. I like to use Visual Studio, the regular Visual Studio, for writing C# based applications. But if I'm writing front-end applications, I like to use TypeScript. When I use TypeScript or Angular or React, or if I'm developing with one of those, I would like to switch to Visual Studio Code because it has a native integration with a lot of these languages and provides nice support, and it's lightweight, and I like the terminal features and all that. Once you fire up, if you're using Visual Studio Code, then you could when you open your folder, which if it has the first project, you have to do a couple of installs for that. C# needs its own extensions to work with Visual Studio Code, so make sure you download the C# extension if you're using Visual Studio Code. And also it asks you, there's a prompt out there to download the assets for Visual Studio for ASP.NET Core applications. So make sure you also download and install the assets. And these are prompts. You don't have to go look for something. As you fire up the Visual Studio Code, you click on the startup class. And don't worry if you don't know what startup class is. We'll get into the structure of the ASP.NET Core default project. That gets created when you actually provision a brand new project, right? So, but make sure you install the tools. The SDK is the first step, and then the tools are the second step, right? So for this, I would prefer to use Visual Studio. So go ahead and install that. If you are not sure about how to install, there's many different options or workloads that you can pick from when you're installing Visual Studio. Just follow an online tutorial. I'm not going to go through each of those steps, but it should be pretty simple. So make sure you just go to Microsoft.com website, and it has the list of steps you need to follow to install Visual Studio. So once you do that, just go ahead and create a first project. You can use the templates, right? And just follow a tutorial. Actually, as a matter of fact, after this, I will actually show you to create a default project, ASP.NET Core project. So just a few clicks on Visual Studio, you should be good to go, right? It creates the boilerplate code for you with the structure. It has all the files to get going. So we'll just create that after this recording. So once you create that, you can just hit run and or debug or whatever, right? In Visual Studio Code, it's run. In Visual Studio, it's debug, and you can run the project, and it runs on a certain port, right? So the port is provisioned for you automatically, and it just means that Visual Studio server, it's called Kestrel server, the server that is actually provisioned with the ASP.NET Core, it's listening to HTTP requests on that port number, right? So it also fires up an HTTP request for you automatically on that port number, and it also shows you the default page that ships with the blanket template, right? So that's kind of the initial steps. So the port number will change. You obviously have the flexibility to go change a port number. I think in VS Code it's 5,000, on Visual Studio it's something else. You can go to the project properties and you can change the default port number as well. Right, I'm going to show all of these steps, don't worry. And next up is if you're using VS Code, obviously you can hit run, and you can also use command prompt to run ASP.NET Core projects, right? You just have to go to the right folder path if you're using a PowerShell command prompt or a regular command prompt. And once you have the .NET CLI, you can also use that to run ASP.NET Core projects, right? So, and the commands are out there on the internet, just like, I will also show you actually. So .NET, they all start with .NET DOT with no spaces or period or anything like that. There's a whole bunch of commands out there, and you can also, if you're a command prompt ninja, then you could use that to create projects, to run projects, and all sorts of stuff. All right, so once you create your project, the next step is to observe the structure of the project. So how does the project structure look like? If you notice that the most important thing that I want to start with is the folder called controllers. Even before that, there is something called startup.cs, which is responsible for starting up your ASP.NET Core application server, which is nothing but Kestrel, right? It configures the server and it starts listening on that specified port number, right? But we're not going to get into that now. But outside of the configuration, the most important thing you need to focus on is the controllers folder. So in the controllers folder, you see a bunch of classes. They're all suffixed with the controller, and they all inherit from the controller base class, right? If you don't understand what a base class is and the classes and all of that, definitely you need to refresh CSharp skills, or you have to basically start there first before we get into the ASP.NET Core framework. So I'm assuming that you're all familiar with that. So you'll notice these controllers in the controllers folder. And inside the controller is nothing but a class, right? It's an object-oriented class. It's a C# class. Within the class, obviously, you group methods, right? You put related methods. You follow the single responsibility principle, and you put all the methods. We call them action methods, specific to ASP.NET Core, right? And these action methods have to be related to somehow. Like they're probably on the same page, or they probably do similar things. One of the architecture principles is things that change together belong together, so that the cost of change is easy to manage. But we're not getting into architecture, but the main thing is, so you'll have the controller class and you have a bunch of action methods in it. That comes with the boilerplate code. So if you notice, these methods are public. Anything that is public is an endpoint, basically. That means you can fire up an HTTP request to ping that specific endpoint or action method. So that's what the action methods are. Next up is, if you notice, there is a default controller. There could be multiple controllers, right? Home is by default the controller that ASP.NET Core uses, but obviously you can change the default. The defaults are set up in the startup.cs. You can go there and you can actually notice that home is set up as a default controller. I will actually show you everything that I'm talking about. Next, these endpoints can return different types of data. They can return HTML data by using a view result, right? View result is a certain type of class which is responsible for returning HTML content back to the browser, right? If you want to return just, like string data, like, just want text or something, you can also obviously return strings. That'll just straight up return text, right? So, and if you want to get into JSON type of data, JSON is a format, right? JavaScript object notation, it's a format. And if you want to return JSON type of data, you can also use iAction result, and you have a bunch of helper methods to also support JSON data. So there are different types of data that you can return using the ASP.NET Core MVC framework. By the way, the MVC stands for Model View Controller. I'm going to explain to you what each of those mean. But we're talking about the class C that stands for controller, right? So all of the controllers are in the folder named controllers, and each of these class files have a suffix controller, right? Next up is I also want you to focus on the views folder, right? So if you look at the project structure, down below you'll have a views folder, and the view is what contains the HTML, right? There could be static views, there could be dynamic views. Static views are all hard-coded, right? There's the data in the view, the data that the HTML is representing does not change. It's always the same. It doesn't matter who pings it. It doesn't matter what type of request. It doesn't depend on anything. It's always giving you the same output. Dynamic data depends on the data that is being passed to the view, right? We call them view models. View models are objects, CSharp classes, that we actually populate the values of the class for each of the properties, and then we supply that to the view so that view can take those models and it can embed them within the model, and it'll just create a full-blown HTML page and return to the browser. And that's what a dynamic view is. And all of those views, since this is a C# project, they all end with an extension .cshtml, right? All of them are underneath the views folder. So go ahead to the views folder. If you notice, under the views folder, there are subfolders within it. So the convention of ASP.NET Core is each matching controller will have its own subfolder within the views folder. So for example, we're talking about the home controller, right? So there will be a folder called home within the views folder. So all the views that the home controller action methods are generating are placed inside the home folder, inside the views folder. So views/home is the placeholder for all the views that the home controller is generating. If you have another controller called, let's say footer controller, right? Or header controller, or something like that, or a navigation controller. So you will have a matching subfolder underneath the view folder, basically with the same name. And inside that subfolder, you will have all the views that that controller is generating based on the HTTP request. So that's the convention. So we'll go with the convention to keep things simple here. We don't have to tweak a lot. I mean, there's no benefit of just messing with the basic convention unless you really, really need to do it. Right, so that's about the views folder. And then there's also another folder in the views folder called shared folder. So the shared folder is basically, it is a placeholder for any view that is not specific to any controller. For example, if the home controller doesn't, it can use it, but it's not generating that. It's not tied up to just home controller. So you have, let's say, 5 different controllers, and all controllers can use it. So that belongs in the shared controller. So there's a folder called shared inside views. That's where you put the views that are shared across all the controllers. All right, we'll see this in action when I show you the demo in just a few seconds here.